Well, thank you for that introduction. No pressure, right? I don't know if I'm a rock star, but I've definitely been through a lot in nonprofit. I love nonprofit. So, me, been CEO of three different Los Angeles nonprofits over about 33 years or so. I retired from a CEO position about 2.5 years ago. So, I've run three different size organizations. Imagination Workshop, which was based at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, Inside Out Community Arts, which I'm the co-founder of, and then a place called Home most recently. And you can see three different size organizations, 400K, a million, and 10 million, different numbers of employees. A place called Home, big campus, multi-service agency, doing all kinds of things. And now I'm really focused on consulting and advising, and my main interests are executive coaching, leadership transition, which is something has become kind of a sweet spot for me. I've been helping a lot of organizations and leaders with planning and then going through transition. I've done it myself 3 times. I've learned a lot from my own mistakes. Organizational culture, deep subject, really requires very significant commitment from organizations to do this right and deeply, but I love doing that. And then board evolution and efficacy, which is a lot of what you all are here for. And then strategic planning. First of all, this is just kind of a general thing that I like to share when I'm working with boards. I call it the board top 10 or the board 10 commandments. Boards wonder, what's our role? And especially with small and mid-sized organizations, even if you're not a startup, a lot of times people coming onto nonprofit boards have never been on a board before. They've never been trained to be on a board before. The executive and the organization may really not know how to use a board efficiently and effectively. It's a little bit of improvisation that's going on, but if there is not a structure and a tool and a system, not just holding people accountable, but supporting people in being accountable, they really may not know what to do. Is it the board's business? Is it big? Is it about the future? Is it core to the mission? Is it connected to core values? Does it include strategic planning? Does it include transformational fundraising? Is there a broad policy decision involved, not just daily on the ground stuff? Is there a red flag up? Is there a legal liability or compliance concern? And does the executive want and need the board's help? So you're not micromanaging and leaning in when not needed. Now, all of this is predicated on something that I'm guessing you must have spoken about at this point in the process, and that is transparency. I always say transparency is my religion. I've founded organizations, but I've also taken on organizations that needed to be turned around. And the thing I've encountered the most is lack of transparency. That happens for many reasons. It's a little bit of a frog in the frying pan thing. People just find themselves there after a while, and they're really only focused on communicating about certain things. I'm talking now about executives and boards, and then other things tend to get obscured. But it's also a red flag if there is not transparency. Here we go into sustainability overview vis-a-vis the board of directors. So first of all, I think of the board of directors as a bridge that spans executive leadership, aspiration, and evolutionary iterations and eras for the organization. In other words, organizations go through changes. And then what about leadership transition and at the board level as well as the executive level? Think of it this way. The board of directors needs to have itself firmly planted in the past and the present and the future so that no matter what is happening at the organization at a staff level, the board is really, if it's a solid, effective board, they are holding the container. And things can change and will change in terms of leadership of the organization and staffing, tweaks to the mission, where are you, how many people are you serving, et cetera, et cetera. So the board should be a constant. Is it usually? Not so much with small and mid-sized organizations. Board engagement, of course, is a big subject because board engagement really covers everything that a board should be involved with. But the focus it down onto, is the board engaged? Is the board holding itself accountable? Does the board take ownership for the strategic plan of the organization, the aspirations of the organization, the long-term goals? Or is it putting out fires? Or is it just barely surviving? Or is it a revolving door where people are coming and going? Was your board chair voluntold that they were going to be the board chair, or did they want to be the board chair? Board culture is intrinsically bound and influences organizational culture. They are not two separate things. And a lot of times I interact with organizations, and I myself have participated in organizations where it feels like the board and the organization itself are siloed from each other, and the executive is running back and forth in between the two, telling staff what the board says and telling the board what staff says. I'm not going to say spinning, but I will say filtering all the information to both the organization and the board through the executive's understanding biases and aspirations. I see this happen a lot when nonprofit executives get together. A lot of times they are complaining about their boards. A lot of times there's this feeling that they're just tolerating their boards. They're just keeping them going. The board is just another task. Shouldn't be that way. It doesn't have to be that way. Imagine, if you will, an effective, dynamic thought partner relationship between the executive and the board chair and the board as a whole. A board where senior staff is involved on committees, where there's an understanding of what the boundaries are, but also what can be shared and communicated with on a contemporaneous basis. And what that does is it changes things for the executive because the executive no longer has to be the holder of everything and the keeper of all knowledge who's going back and forth. If senior staff is really integrated into the process through committees, then things start flowing in a much different way, and you're not dependent on the bottleneck, the executive, to get things done. So, with an accountable, high functioning board with strong structure, transparent culture, and that is in sync and collaborating with the executive and staff leadership. An organization's long-term aspirations and highest standards are much more achievable. And I am speaking from experience. So I have been the executive director slash CEO for three different organizations, three different sizes. I have worked for three different boards. I have built boards. I have rebooted boards that needed to be rebooted. And now, as a consultant, I've worked with at least 20 different organizations and been very involved in all cases with what's happening at the board level. And I've also created a program that lives at Envision Consulting called Board Builders, which is really about supporting boards in the fundamentals. When I say that the board and the staff need to work together, I don't mean on the same things at the same time. What I mean is they each have a role and they need to collaborate and share with each other in a contemporaneous way so that each of them can do their job with the knowledge of what is happening on the other side of the equation. And then on the committees, yes, they work together on the committees, but where staff functions on the board committees is to make sure that the board understands what the decisions are that it's making, how they are playing out on the ground at the organization with the programs, with the constituents. Oh, well, you know what? We in the committee, the board decided that we were going to do X, Y, and Z. It didn't work that way when we tried it out on the ground. So instead of that coming back to you in a report months later, if you're sitting on a committee with senior staff, they're telling you, within a week, within 2 weeks of implementing something, whether it worked or not. Or when you're working on a strategic plan, got to have senior staff involved because they're letting you know what? Our capacity is limited in that area, or we just lost an employee, or somebody's on maternity leave. That's going to impact how quickly we can do those things, what they cost. We used to have a partner who did that. They no longer do it. So it's really about sharing information and counting on each other to execute on the roles, the separate, very separate roles that you have, but making sure that there is flow of information. If you create kind of an Uber structure to the committees and you have some continuity about what their agendas look like, what their minutes look like, is everything stored on the cloud somewhere where anybody on the board can access it at any time. They don't have to request it from the staff and then, oh, I didn't get it. So people end up having to do the same task over and over and over again. I think there's an opportunity here to integrate the efforts of the board and the staff and committees. Here's the other thing I hear from board members. I get on a committee and there's no agenda. There's no charter to the committee. We don't know what we're supposed to accomplish or how it really fits into the strategic plan or the bigger picture. So every committee should should have a charter that is connected back to the strategic plan if you have it. Each committee should actually, there should be a dotted line between the work of the committee and a goal in the strategic plan, maybe even more than one goal. Because the strategic plan is a unifying document. And if it's done correctly and it's achievable and senior staff has been involved and there's an operational version of it that talks about the who, the when, the how, and what it's going to cost for each of those things, then the committee has its marching orders and you create a charter for each committee. But it does need to be structured. The last thing you want is people getting together for a committee and then sitting there and they really don't have anything to do, or they don't know what they're doing, or they don't know how what they're doing relates to the bigger mission. This may be kind of a radical thing to say, and it may cause you some anxiety, but I believe that in many respects, organizations should run as if the executive is leaving in about 18 months. And the reason I say that is having left 3 different organizations, planning for my departure, especially the last one. I learned so much from the first 2 and mistakes that I made. And the last one, I really feel like we nailed it. And it really supported me into my consulting work and helping people do this. But if you think about it as if you're going to be leaving within the next year and a half or so, what would be the things that you would do? Well, one thing is you should always be deepening your bench. And what that means is, I think about that old kind of cliche saying, but it's a good one when they asked Wayne Gretzky, why is he so good and shoots so goals? He said, I don't go where the puck is, I go where the puck is going. And so deepening your bench is about thinking around corners, being a futurist, looking ahead to what your organization is going to need. And also, as an executive and as a board chair, being really honest with yourselves about what your strengths are and what your gaps are, and what are the things that you need to fill for the organization. There's no reason to feel threatened by it. You can say, you know what, I'm really good at this, but if I were hiring me, and I know Jonathan, I know what his skills are, I know what his gaps are, this is what I would hire him to do, and I would get somebody else to do that. Now, obviously, this is easier said than done because all of this has budget implications. But if it's baked into your thinking, then every hire you make, you're thinking about, is this somebody who could transcend and move up, become an executive? What are the gaps that they fill? Training, really critical for your staff. It's important for them because it boosts their morale. It gets them more invested in your organization. But what it also does is if you have what's called a learning organization, every time you strengthen your staff, you strengthen the organization. And every time they get trained to do something new, you're adding to the capacity of the organization. Promote high achievers. Don't let people languish. Good people can get jobs elsewhere and will be headhunted and picked off. So look at them, support them in their trajectory in their career at your organization, and make sure that you promote them as soon as you can and as soon as it makes sense for them, because you want to keep them. Let go of dead weight. It's hard to do. I never got really good at firing people. It's critical because I can almost guarantee you that every time you've ever fired somebody, it's been a relief. Some part of you knew that you should have done it 6 months earlier. Try to get ahead of that. You're not doing anybody any favors by keeping people longer than they should be at your organization. Prepare for leadership succession. Asterisk there, I can share with you, if you don't already have it, an emergency succession template. I have a number of different pieces of collateral that I can share with folks. Prepare for leadership succession, and that means really thinking and talking with your board, talking with your board chair, talking with your senior staff about how things would work if it were an emergency succession, but in your mind, also thinking about what are the things that you want to accomplish and leave in good shape, and how would you want to facilitate and support the organization through a transition? If you do all those things, even if you end up staying another 10 years, I guarantee you, you will have a stronger, more nimble, more sustainable organization. Create strategic plans and achievable. I emphasize that they're achievable. 3 to 5 year plans, but with a 10-year horizon. Have aspiration in there. You may have a plan that really needs to focus right now on stabilizing your organization or getting your programs up to speed or doing program evaluation because you need to be more competitive in that way, or, fundraising, building a development machine. All of those are things that usually show up in strategic plans, especially with smaller and mid-sized organizations. But think down the line. Where do you want to be 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And just have a parking lot in your plan so that as you are making changes and decisions and hires, you're thinking about how those might fit into your long-term aspirations. I talked about this earlier. Involve senior staff in creating the plan and creating an operational version with clarity on the who, when, how, and how much. I have a template for that I'm happy to share with you all. It really gets down into the weeds, much further down into the weeds than you want to with a board. But once you have your strategic plan, the staff is going to do most of the work and they need to have a roadmap. And you as the leader need to have clarity about, delegation. Who's doing what? How long is it going to take? What team is involved? And what is it going to cost? And then you need to be reporting back to the board on a regular basis. So include accountability tools, timelines, and status reporting with your plan. You've all heard this before. Good strategic plan is a living document that is breathing and responding so that when you're reporting back to the board, the committee, the strategic planning committee does not disband once the plan is approved. It becomes responsible at that point for quarterly or semi-annual reports back to the board on how we're doing against our plan. And if you have a timeline, whether it's a Gantt chart or a spreadsheet of some kind, you can say to the board at those reports, we're on track, we're off track, we need to change this goal because something changed that we need to respond to. We need to let go of this one or put a pin in it until next time we do a strategic plan. We have this new thing that we hadn't thought about when we made this plan that is really critical now. It needs to be a living, breathing document that is a roadmap and gives you a sense of where you're going and what it's going to take to get there, but is not written in stone. I remember years ago, I attended a conference, and whenever I go to conferences, and I'm sure you all do this, I always think if I can come away with just one thing, one jewel, then it will have been worth it, even sitting through the boring sessions. And I remember I was at this conference, and I don't even remember what the conference was, but there was this one speaker, and he said that a dream without a plan is a hallucination. And I've never forgotten that. Let's move into the fiscal oversight part of this session. What kind of board have you built? Do you have business people? Do you have accounting expertise and legal expertise, HR, insurance expertise on the board? You need at least a quarter of your directors to be able to read and understand budget spreadsheets. It doesn't work when everybody on the board's eyes glaze over and they just aren't poking holes at the budget and really understanding what they're committing to. You need a board finance and audit committee that provides regular budgetary oversight, that previews and vets the annual budget for approval. Hopefully you're having an annual budget meeting where the board approves your budget, that previews your audit. And I put an asterisk there because the committee should meet at least once with the auditor without the executive present and once with the board without the executive present to share findings from the audit or things that the auditor might say. And what the auditor might say, it's not about getting the executive in trouble. It's about having a clear understanding of fiduciary responsibility. And the auditor might say something to the board like, the monthly reconciliations are happening 2 months after the close of the month. That's really not a best practice. And it's putting you guys behind in terms of knowing what's really coming down the pike and your cash flow projections and all those kinds of things. Or they might say the chain of custody of checks, there are unsigned checks being left on the executive's desk. Anybody could go into that office and get to those. It's important for the auditor to have a safe place to talk to the committee. It's important for the committee to be able to relay these things back to the board, not to get the executive in trouble, but so that everybody understands what's going on and then takes the steps necessary to make things better. This committee also looks at the year-end financial statement and looks at all of those things before they are shared with the board. And then imagine this, executives, that when you go in to present your year-end financials, you go in to present your audit, you go in to present the budget, You're not alone. The committee has already talked to you, poked holes in things, satisfied themselves so that when they go into the board, they can say, we've looked at this, we've poked holes in it, we recommend that this be approved. There's a lot of weight that is carried by a committee saying that. Of course, you as the executive are going to come in and say, I want you to approve this budget. Yes, it's got a $500,000 projected deficit, but we can get there. And you want the board to approve it. Well, the committee should have already poked holes in that, pushed back on you. How are we going to get that 500K? Well, we actually have a surplus from last year because we got a multi-year grant and it's going to do a cash disbursement this year. So even though it looks like on an accrual basis we have a deficit, we actually don't have a deficit. Okay, the committee should know all of that and be totally satisfied so that they can come in alongside you and say, we recommend that this be approved. And the board trusts them and deputizes them to look after the interests of the organization and to do the diligence of the board. Your development department, and I recognize with small organizations, a development department might be one person, or it might even be the executive is doing development. I have strong feelings about that. You should have a separate development professional, not be depending on your executive director to be writing grants and doing all the development work. So let's say you do have at least that, and maybe you have a team. They should be able to provide good income projections, starting with when you take that budget projection in to be approved by the board. Right alongside that should be an income projection, and it should have scenarios, like different weather scenarios. So if the weather's good, we're projecting that we're going to get 70% of our foundation proposals are going to be fulfilled. If it's cloudy out there, politics, blah, 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 we're thinking more like 60%. And if things are really tough, it could go as low as 45%. In each of those scenarios, this budget is going to produce X, Y, Z at the end. A surplus in the good weather scenario, a small deficit in the cloudy weather scenario, and a deficit of 150K in the last scenario. How are we going to deal with that? Well, then that's when you start negotiating. Well, all of the new hires are saved until after July 1st. So yes, it's true that we're asking you to increase the budget by 15% this year, but most of that increase isn't going to happen until after the middle of the fiscal year. By then, we'll know a lot more about how our year is going. We will have had our annual fundraiser. We will have found out about this big grant we were going to. So at that point, we could adjust. We could leave vacancies open and save $1,000 a month or more that way. We could do an extra fundraiser. We could postpone this new program that we're kicking off. So you want to keep an eye on all of those things and income projections, good income projections, realistic income projections that are updated quarterly with actuals and new prospects. I had a template for that we built at my organization, and it would even include $250,000 in new prospects we haven't even thought of yet. And so on a quarterly basis, we would say, yeah, we found new money, and that would change. Also, this is a conceptual thing. Contextualize and think and plan beyond your fiscal year. People feel so bound by the fiscal year. Oh, where are we going to be at on June 30th or July 1st? That is just, you might as well just throw a dart at the calendar, okay, and see which date it lands on. That is just an artificial start and end of your fiscal year. What if you had a grant that you projected was going to come in early June, and the foundation says, listen, we're going to give you the money, but we can't do it until July. Your whole fiscal year changes if you're on an accrual basis, right? You projected that 300K in June, and now you've got a $300,000 deficit because it's not coming in until July. No, no, no. Don't stress yourself out. Don't get anxious about that. Look at the trends for your organization. Start looking at 2-year, 3-year, 5-year trends. Is your organization healthy? Is the income growing every year? Is your capacity growing every year? Your staff, is it growing every year? Yes, you had an accrual deficit last year, but with cash disbursements, you have a cash surplus. It's really important to understand that. And I have something available for you if you want. On an annual basis, when I presented budgets to the board, because sometimes you have new people coming. I always shared this. I would do it out loud, but I would also give it to them in written form. This little explanation that I put together of the difference between cash and accrual accounting. So important for nonprofits to know. I make the analogy between nonprofits and farming. Farmers go borrow money to get the seeds and get the equipment and plant all the crops and stuff, and they're projecting what their harvest is going to be. But it is based on a good weather projection. What if there's a drought? What if there's a freeze? What if there's a flood? All of what we're doing is educated guessing, our best ass educated guessing that we can do based on previous experience, what's happening in the landscape, and having development professionals who are paying attention to what the trends are. But start thinking beyond your fiscal year. Consider, of course, multi-year funding. Hopefully, you're getting some multi-year funding. And on an accrual basis, you account for all, if you get a $500,000 grant over 5 years, you account for all of it the year that it is pledged to you. So you put 500K in that year, it's going to look like a big year with a big surplus. And then the following 4 years, you're going to get 100K in cash each year, but it doesn't show up on your accrual accounting. Does that make sense? Does everybody understand that? If you don't, it's definitely something you need to do. And I always, with my boards, I would present the budget both in a cash and accrual so that there was no question about where we were. Reserves, really important. Set a goal if you can to amass a 6 to 12 month reserve over time. The way I did it, I took over an organization that was running at a deficit. We did increase our fundraising and everything. But what I started doing was just putting aside $10,000 a month. Not enough to really hurt in terms of operations. Obviously, it needs to be unrestricted funding, but it adds up. Suddenly, at the end of the year, you got 120 grand in there. 2 years, 240 grand. And consider establishing an endowment. And there's more than one kind of endowment. The classic endowment is somebody gives you $5 million for an endowment. What does that mean? You can't touch the $5 million. You can only touch the interest on the $5 million. And honestly, that's not that much these days, right? I mean, maybe you can get 4% on it. It's better than a sharp stick in the eye, but it's not a lot of money. Instead, I counsel, and I did this myself, to create with the board, create something called a self-endowment where you are putting savings aside in a identified endowment, but you set the terms on it. Basically, yes, you're going to be accruing interest and using the interest every year, but you set the terms because it's a self-endowment, and you say, in an emergency, if we have to, we can pull cash out of this endowment. But what it does is it signals to your funders, especially individuals who want to give to the long-term sustainability, that you are thinking about the long term. If you do have a reserve, a sizable reserve, then look at getting an investment strategy and getting support around that. Now, this is something really great that most organizations don't know about. And it came to me as sort of an epiphany, and I started doing it with all the organizations I ran. Issue RFPs for bankers and investment advisors if you're going to get them. Get them competing for your business. It doesn't matter how small you are. Banks want nonprofits in their portfolios. It makes them look good. I have a template for this RFP I can share with you. And you can get them competing. Like, we're not going to charge you any fees. Checks are going to be free. Our philanthropy department is going to give you $10,000 a year. Plus, we're willing to host a board building lunch for you once a year. And we're going to provide volunteers. You would be amazed. And if you have a current relationship that you're happy with, fine, invite them to compete on the RFP. You will be amazed. In fact, every time I did this, I usually ended up splitting the business between 2 or even 3 banks because they came in with competitive proposals and I didn't want to lose any of them. And you can get board members out of this too. It's a combination of, first of all, assessing what's holding you back, what's missing, making clear there's a definition for where you're trying to get to, and then you reverse engineer it. Define what a good, effective board looks like and an organization running well looks like. And then you reverse engineer from there and figure out what are the steps that it's going to take to get there and who's going to do them and by when and what is it going to cost. A lot of that can go into a strategic plan, but it doesn't have to be called a strategic plan. It can just be your board action plan. I will say, this isn't a commercial for me per se, but I will say that bringing in outside consultants who have much more objectivity and who have more experience and who can assess what's working for you, what's not working, and what needs to change. And then create a plan for it, hold yourselves accountable, and maybe include in the engagement with the consultant that they continue coming after that initial engagement. They come to your board meetings, or they come to committee meetings, or they come to staff meetings, and they help you with accountability and tracking. The other thing is, I have this idea, it's in its infancy, but I have come to believe, having worked with a lot of organizations that have kind of dysfunctional boards, honestly, that one thing that could help would be an interim board chair. Somebody who knows how to run a board, who comes in not just as a consultant, but actually runs your board for 3 or 4 meetings and goes to committee meetings and holds people accountable. Board chair can shadow them. One of the things I hear a lot from small organizations is we need to build our board up. Our board isn't doing very well. They're not engaged. They're not raising money. We need more people on the board. Well, actually, no. The worst thing you can do is recruit more people onto a dysfunctional board. All it does is lower the bar for everybody. You really need to work on fixing things before you start bringing in new board members. By the way, I have a board service agreement that I've developed over years that includes accommodating for stakeholders who have a different give get from others on the board. And there are a couple of different ways to do it. But what it does is it honors and values the value that people bring with lived experience or constituents, et cetera, sets it up in a way that makes sure that everybody understands why it's important to have stakeholders on the board. And there's no sense of shame or anything about the fact that some people bring some certain kind of money and other people do other things. That's something I'm also happy to share with you. I'm a big proponent for having an advisory council of people who are either transitioning off the board, but you don't want to lose them, so they can go on the advisory council, or people who don't really have the capacity to sit on the board and meet the expectations on the board, but you still want them and you want to have access to them. But I was specifically talking about getting stakeholders, former participants in your program, community people, parents on your board. It's a big thing to talk about because it impacts the culture of the board, no question about it. And there are pros and cons or things about it that are easy and things about it that are hard, but it's a discussion that you should have as a board with your executive, and especially if your mission includes equity and inclusion, you really need to have this conversation. I have had something I call an advisory council that is specifically made up of a different demographic. Like at a place called home, we had the board, and then we had what we called a leadership council, which was focused on recruiting young professionals who it would be a bit of a training ground for them ultimately to matriculate onto the big board. But the whole idea was that it was for young professionals, and we targeted the entertainment and the music industry. The way it worked is the chair of that body had a seat on the board and they had a vote. So, but they would be representing this leadership council of 15, 20 something folks who were getting trained and indoctrinated on how to serve a nonprofit. And over the years, a number of them matriculated onto the board. A regular advisory council, let's say you have a body where when people leave your board, they have the option of sitting on this advisory council. That would not have a vote. They could sit on committees. That's the other thing to know, is that your committees don't just have to be board members. They can be other kinds of volunteers. Certain committees, no. Governance committee, no. But fundraising committee, real estate committee that's looking for a new site, something along those lines, yes, you can have other people sit on the committee. Nonprofits should always be asking the question, are we still relevant? Is there still a reason for us to exist in this form? Is our mission still responsive? Is the need still what it was when this mission was made? There's no shame in looking at where you are and saying, you know what? The landscape has changed. The things that we used to do that were so important and so relevant are no longer. Now, that's different from saying, well, the funders don't seem to have an appetite anymore for what we do, but what we do is actually more important than ever. Two really different things, right? So one of them is about necessary introspection and keeping that question alive at all times. Are we still relevant? Are we still cutting edge? Are we still serving an urgent need in the community? And if the answer is yes, then I would be hard pressed to advise you to change anything about what you're doing, except maybe to figure out ways to reframe it so that funders can understand why it's important. If the answer is no, things have changed. It's like this really painful discussion. I think you need to do the introspection anyway as a nonprofit. Are we relevant? Are we still serving an urgent need? If the answer is no, then you need to have a real soul searching conversation about how do you want to pivot. If the answer is yes, but the funders just don't get it anymore, or politically the climate has changed, then you're going to need to adapt and innovate and figure out how and where and from whom you're going to raise the money that you need because your cause is still relevant. I think that when it comes to actually providing support to make systemic change at an organization, we would need to do some more focused one-on-one work and engagement. I'd be happy to do. I do have a couple of slots coming up in 2026. It doesn't have to cost that much. My fee is $250 an hour. We can accomplish a fair amount in 10 sessions depending on what we're focusing on. And I don't do retainer because I just don't think it's fair to either party. I charge you for the time that I spend with you. And I share templates for things, and I'll even share connections if it's appropriate to do so. I would be certainly open to meeting with you all as a group if you could identify kind of what are the top 3 or 5 issues. I have a lot up here and I'm happy to share it. I think the first thing, just top of my mind, that would make sense would be to meet with the board chairs and really kind of zero in on nuance it a little bit. What are the things that you really need? And it's going to be different from organization to organization. Every organization is so idiosyncratic that I would need to come in, do an assessment, and I have a board assessment form to really zero in on what your board needs. Here's the thing, to be really blunt, I get asked to do board trainings and consulting a lot, and I have done a lot of it, and it's good. And I go in and set some structure and templates and get some committees going, and everybody's nodding their heads and, yeah, we're going to be accountable and this and that. And then the engagement ends and, I check in with the executive a month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months later, and it falls apart. So I'm less and less inclined to do that kind of thing because the level of commitment that it takes from the board chair and the executive to build a culture that is self-regulating and holds itself accountable, that is a really deep commitment. Now, I believe, because I've experienced it, that you can build a culture where the board and the executive are just humming along in sync. Senior staff is involved. There's a sense of common understanding and contemporaneous understanding of what's happening, but it really requires laying some track and commitments and perhaps moving some people along. And so it's a deep commitment. It's not just coming in and doing one-off trainings. I can do that, but I'll be honest, my experience is that they don't stick. I'll send these all to Alejandra. You can distribute them at will. I give all this stuff away. You all need it. This is me. You'd be in touch if you'd like to. Be happy to hear from any of you. I really appreciate the opportunity to spend this time with you, and I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's have an exploratory conversation and decide together. I support what you're doing, and I've been there. I'm happy to share. I wish you all the best. You are doing such important work, and it is needed more than ever. And we're living through really perilous times, so we got to take good care of each other and take good care of ourselves.